All right, good afternoon, everybody. Hi, guys. Good afternoon. Hi. Nobody else is going to say hi to me? Hi, okay, good to see you guys. It's lonely up here sometimes. Come on. All right, all right. Okay, well, just a couple reminders before we dive into the material for today. We've got no class Friday, okay, because of the inauguration. And then Monday's class will have exam number 2. Okay, there is a review session tonight to help you prepare for the exam. I have office hours appointments still available. If you want to meet and talk about anything, even if you don't see any available on my schedule, let me know. I've got other times both tomorrow and Friday that we could meet. So happy to help you prepare for that. You could still sign up for tutoring as well. Again, just kind of reminding you of all those resources to help you get ready for the next exam. Okay. Yeah, any questions about that? Today's material is not on exam 2. Right, so this is like the Wednesday before the exam, like we would normally do, even though the exam's on Monday. So today's material will be on exam 3. Everything leading up to this. Before that is the stuff on exam 2. Okay. All right. Any questions? Yeah. Listen. Yeah. So I kind of changed the wording in the schedule sheet that has the lab stuff from your guys' feedback last time. So now it says very specifically abdominal arteries of the cat, and then the human arteries of the head and neck, and the as well as the human heart model again. So all of those things. It was kind of a review of the human heart model stuff, but then there were the arteries in the head. So there's mostly, that's all just diagram stuff. And then there's arteries going up into the neck that you need to know for the human stuff as well. All of that's in the handout, so just use the handout to study for those things. But those are the human parts that are on it. And then it's all those abdominal arteries and organs that you saw last time in the cat. Okay, so not just the arteries, but the actual just identifying the organs too. The kidneys and the liver and those different things you had to identify in the cat. And then again, as always with the arteries, if it says what tissue they supply underneath, then that's part of what you need to know for the quiz as well. Morgan, yeah? Same format as this week, yep. So printed paper, color, images like that. Yeah. Other questions? Okay, all right, well, let's dive into this. Today, we're diving into the female reproductive system. And so we'll start with the anatomy portion, and then we'll dive into the physiology and the menstrual cycle. So let's start with the ovaries. That's still frozen. Hold on. Okay, so ovaries, these are the gonads in the female anatomy, and they contain the eggs, the gametes, right? And so they're protected by tunica albuginea. We saw that same name and same structure in the testes in the males. And so the cells that we find inside of the ovaries are the egg cells themselves, the gametes, kind of go by the name of oocyte, ova, eggs, all of those things. And then there's what are called the nurse cells, which are also known as the granulosa cells. Okay. And these are organized into follicles, to remember as kind of like a little basket, kind of like a little group of eggs with some space in the middle. Okay, so the follicle is this. This is the follicle. So we'll be referring to the follicle a lot, and that's always referring to this that contains the egg on the inside, but there's all these other cells around it, as well as some open space in the middle. Okay. And so these cells, these granulosa cells, protect the egg, they surround it, and there's a lot of them for one egg. These are the equivalent of those Sertoli cells in the testes. Those were just one for many sperm. This is the opposite, many of these cells for one egg. Okay, and these are the primary source of estrogen in females. And then the other main type of cell is called the thecal cells. And these are kind of between the follicles, and you can see them on the outside of the follicle there. They release something called androstenedione, which can be converted into estrogen by other cells there in the follicle as well. So it's pretty much a precursor to estrogen. So this is just kind of a cool image of the female anatomy on the inside there. So you can see the uterus in the middle, the fallopian tubes here, and then the ovaries right here. Okay, and those ovaries you can see actually aren't fully continuous with the fallopian tubes, and we'll watch a little video on that in a second. And the fallopian tube has to kind of come towards the ovaries to catch the egg when it's released during ovulation. So, okay, the uterine tubes or fallopian tubes here, typically around 4 inches long. Again, not continuous with the ovaries, and so the clinical significance of that is that there can be something called an ectopic pregnancy, where in very rare cases, a fertilized egg can come outside of the uterus and the fallopian tubes and kind of start growing out there in the cavity. It doesn't result in a successful pregnancy, obviously, but it can be a dangerous thing. And that since there's this open space here, there can also is also kind of risk of infection at times because this is just open to, oops, sorry. This is just open to the space that's inside of what's called the peritoneal cavity. Okay, so these uterine tubes have an inner layer, which is a type of columnar epithelial tissue. Remember last time we saw in the video of fertilization, there were the cilia kind of beating to kind of help move the egg downwards, but then that actually makes a current for the sperm to kind of go against. The next layer in is a muscular layer. So it's all smooth muscle. Function of that also helps to move the egg and move the whole tube to kind of go towards the ovaries when ovulation occurs and catch that egg. And fertilization typically occurs in the uterine tubes, and then the fertilized egg makes its way down and eventually can implant in the uterus. Okay, any questions on this so far? Okay, we're going to watch a brief little video here that kind of shows the process of ovulation. Details of the menstrual cycle here towards the end of class today, but we'll continue on with the anatomy here first. Get that going there right again. Okay. All right. Okay, so now on to the uterus. Okay, so the uterus has 3 layers. Okay, the inner layer is known as the endometrium. Endometrium is a mucous membrane, lots of blood vessels in it, lots of glands. Okay, this is what goes through cycles of development and necrosis. And this is what majority of menstrual bleeding is made up of, menstrual discharge is made up of, is this endometrial layer. Okay, this is where implantation occurs and where fetal development occurs. So that's the most inner layer where the egg's going to implant. And then the middle layer is all muscle. This is known as the myometrium. Myometrium is the majority of the thickness of the uterus. This is all smooth muscle fibers, and they're all oriented in different directions. So they're not like parallel, but they're oriented in multiple directions. Very, very strong muscle tissue to be able to kind of completely collapse on itself and do just what they need to do, which is push that baby through the birth canal. And then the most outer layer called the perimetrium. And this is the serous membrane on the outside of the uterus. And just like other serous membranes we've talked about, there is a 2-layer membrane with a fluid-filled space on the inside. We'll see one of these around the heart, around the lungs, around other large organs like that that move a lot. It makes for a nice lubricating surface on the outside of that organ. Okay, questions on that so far? Go ahead. Endometriosis, yeah, it's kind of an abnormal growth of the endometrial layer. And so, yeah, it's definitely like a painful condition. And it can result in, yeah, very, very painful menstruation and definitely painful periods of the menstrual cycle. But that's kind of the main idea is kind of just this like overgrowth, necessarily like abnormal growth of the endometrial layer. Yeah, good question. Other questions? Okay, let's go ahead and do this labeling here. So with the structures we just talked about, we can label those 5 things, and you can answer this question here. And again, go ahead and turn to the people on your team and walk through this, make sure you're on the same page with this, as well as the answer to the question. You can send that in on your clickers there when you're ready. All right, go ahead and send in that answer if you haven't yet. All right, anybody else? Got 42 there. Give you another 5 seconds to go ahead and send that in. Okay, so we're kind of between A and E here. Okay, so A is that most inner layer of the uterus, which is the endometrium. Okay, that's where implantation occurs. That's where the fertilized egg implants. B would be the muscular layer of the uterus, the myometrium, and then C is that external layer, the serous membrane, the parametrium. And then we've got D being the ovaries themselves, and E being the uterine tube or the fallopian tube. And E, the fallopian tube, is typically where fertilization happens, is where the egg comes together with the sperm. And conception and fertilization are a lot of times kind of used interchangeably. Sometimes conception can kind of mean the whole process of implantation and all of that. What I was really getting at there was fertilization. Okay, questions on that at all? Okay. Okay, so moving on with the anatomy. Now moving on to the, oh yeah, to the external anatomy. The vagina is made up of mostly smooth muscle as well as mucous membrane. This is a type of stratified squamous epithelial tissue, just like our skin. This was the moist type, where the skin is the keratinized type. The hymen is considered kind of the outermost portion of this mucous membrane that mostly blocks the opening before sexual intercourse occurs, and this may bleed upon first sexual intercourse. And so functions of the vagina, pretty obvious: sexual intercourse, passageway for menstrual flow, and obviously the birth canal. And then the other portions of the external genitalia, the clitoris is erectile tissue, very similar to the penis as far as the anatomical setup with the arteries and the central veins, very similar to that. And then it's controlled by the parasympathetic nervous system, just like erection in males is controlled by the parasympathetic, similar to that in females. Then the skin folds on the outside are known as the labia majora and minora. And these are protective skin folds. And then lots of glands as well. So the vestibular glands are kind of collections of glands. There's a bunch of different ones. They all have different names, but we'll just call them all the vestibular glands for the purpose of this class. These sit behind the labia and secrete different lubricating fluids kind of in preparation for and during intercourse. That bottom line there says function, secrete lubricating fluid during and before intercourse. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and move on to labeling those structures we just talked about. There is a question there on the top, which number is similar to the bulbourethral glands that we talked about last class in males? So this one, you'll send in a number instead of a letter. We'll go ahead and label those things and talk through that with the people on your team. Again, if you're in the front of your team, turn to the people behind you, chat about these things, fill this in, and decide on an answer together. All right, so with this type of question, you'll put a number in, then hit the send button. Make sure to hit that send button.
She ran office.
That little office. All right, give me about 5 more seconds. Go ahead and hit send to make sure your answer went in there. Still only got about 28 of you. All right, anybody else? All right, I'll leave it open for a sec. Most of you are in there, but about half of you are putting 6, and then about 2/3 or about a third of you are putting what was that? 4. So we'll get to that in a sec. So obviously we have the image here with the skin and everything intact, and the labia, and then down here with everything removed, but some of the same labeling in both. So number 1 there is the clitoris. And there's kind of multiple portions to it, just like in the penis. And so there were multiple things covered up there, but you can just call it the clitoris. You don't need to know the different parts of it. Okay. And then we have the 2 layers of skin folds there, 2 and 3. So the labia majora and the labia minora. And 4 is the external urethral orifice. And so different than male anatomy, there is really no shared reproductive and urinary tract portion like there is in males, right? There's a shared portion, but in females, it's two separate tracts. Okay, then number 5 is the hymen. Number 6, there's a bunch of different ones pointing to 6, right? And that's kind of like what I said, but there's just a bunch of different glands all included in this. And this is just kind of, you don't have to know the names of all those. You can just call them the vestibular glands. And so that is the equivalent of the bulbourethral gland in males. So number 6 is the correct answer there. And that's what about 60% of you put. So one thing that I think is important to point out is the setup of the anatomy here. So if we look at this kind of bird's eye view, superior view of where the ovaries sit, where the uterus sits in relation to the bladder and the pelvis, you can see the bladder is pretty much smashed between the uterus and the pubic symphysis, right? So we can see that right here, okay, down here at the bottom. And so no wonder pregnant women have to go to the bathroom all the time, right? Because that uterus gets bigger and bigger and bigger, right? And it's just smashing the bladder against the pubic symphysis all the more and more the larger that gets, right? So the bladder becomes very small with a lot of pressure on it, especially in late stage pregnancy. Questions about any of this? Okay. Just before we go to the next slide, take note of the anatomy of the clitoris here versus what this slide looks like. Okay. And this kind of gets at the idea that it's actually been unknown for a long time, the full anatomy of the clitoris. And so this has led to some major disruptions in female anatomy, not on purpose, but like if a woman has a tumor that needs to be removed or some portion of the clitoris that needs to be removed, or some portion of the labia that needs to be removed with vaginal cancer, which is somewhat common. They end up a lot of times removing a lot of the clitoris as well because it actually spans this much larger region than was once known, and kind of causes major disruptions in sexual function as well as just a lot of pain as well because it's a very sensitive tissue. And so even in the textbook that we have, it has the old anatomy of it, which is not the way it is actually at all. And so yeah, kind of a lot of advocates out there now to kind of educate doctors on actually knowing the full anatomy of the clitoris because it's a very important aspect to not remove more than is needed for certain surgical procedures. So just I'll point that out. So questions on any of that? Okay. All right. Well, we're going to transition into talking about development of the egg cells. Okay. And this process is known as oogenesis. Okay. And so one grouping of cells are called the oogonium, and these are the stem cells that are active during fetal life in females. Okay. And so during fetal development, about 6 to 7 million oogonia are formed. So mitotically dividing, meaning not like meiosis that we normally talk about with gamete cells, but mitosis, so we're expanding the population of cells that are going to then eventually become eggs. That only happens during fetal development, okay? And then these cells start the process of meiosis, okay? And that starts before birth, but then they pretty much get stuck in meiosis 1 until they're become recruited for ovulation later on. Okay, so some of these Some of this resumes during puberty, but then some will stay paused for the whole, for 50 years or more. Some actually never progress on before menopause occurs. And so this idea that women are not making more eggs throughout their lifetime is known as atresia. So it's like the number of eggs are slowly dropping because you're only developing new eggs during fetal development. And then each ovulation is one less egg that you have. And so initially the thought was that menopause was caused by running out of eggs, but that's not the case. 6 to 7 million eggs are way more than are ever ovulated in the lifetime of a female. And so that's not an issue. It's typically only about 300 to 500 ovulations that actually occur during that reproductive period. And so menopause is actually more related to kind of change in ovary function, and then ovulation just stops happening. It's really the ovary's responsiveness to LH and FSH that kind of changes with aging, and ovulation just doesn't occur anymore. So questions on that at all? Okay, so here's kind of the structures in the egg and the follicle, right? So the egg is the little part in the center. The follicle is a big part that surrounds it, okay? So we have a couple different things here, a couple different kind of key terms to understand here: the mature, the Graafian follicle, the corpus luteum. And so I'll just kind of uncover these so you can see the names of these. You don't have to worry too much about this, about these stages, just knowing that this is kind of our primary stage here, where we have an egg and then just a little tiny follicle around it, just a small layer of cells. And then during the menstrual cycle, that follicle is growing. Right, so that cell layer is thickening till it gets to this big stage, and so this would be the Graafian follicle would be seen there in number 4. Okay, that's like the full size with an actual kind of open space in the middle called the antrum. Okay, so that's a fully matured follicle, and that it gets to that point right before ovulation. And then ovulation occurs, and so you can see the egg leaving the follicle there, right? So then after ovulation has occurred, the follicle still functions. Now it's not just holding the egg, it's now an endocrine organ that's releasing a bunch of hormones, which it was doing before, but that's all it's doing now. And so then it's called the corpus luteum at that point. So 6 is the corpus luteum. This is the follicle after it's released the egg. Okay, so you don't necessarily need to be able to differentiate between all these words over here, but the big part is just kind of seeing how the follicle grows through the ovulatory cycle, knowing what the fully mature one looks like in number 4 there, and then knowing that after we release the egg, then it's called the corpus luteum. Okay. So let's walk through the female sex hormones here. So same ones that two of the same ones we talked about in males. Okay, so LH and FSH. Okay, so LH is known as luteinizing hormone. It's named that because it causes ovulation and it causes the formation of that corpus luteum that we were just talking about. So LH goes to those thecal cells, or those interstitial cells, and causes them to produce this precursor to estrogen called androstenedione, and then that gets converted into estrogen. FSH causes the follicle to grow. So again, it's named for that function, follicle stimulating hormone, right? It causes that follicular growth, and it stimulates those granulosa cells to not only grow, but also to release estrogen and release inhibin, just like those hormones we saw, just like inhibin, how we saw that in males as well. Okay, so estrogen comes from the follicle in response to FSH and stimulates growth of the endometrium. So when estrogen is released, it causes that endometrial layer to grow, right? Whereas FSH is released, it causes the follicle to grow. So 2 different kind of hormones there causing growth in different places. Progesterone kind of becomes the main player after ovulation, and especially after implantation. It helps to maintain the endometrium, to keep the endometrium alive in case implantation happens. And then it's also going to keep that alive during the early stages of pregnancy as well. Okay, so we can just kind of walk through this here because I want to save some time to get through the menstrual cycle. Oops. So again, you don't have to know the name of that hypothalamic hormone, but that's what number 1 would be. Don't worry about that. It's kind of on top of each other. But and then that's going to go to the anterior pituitary, cause the release of FSH and LH, right? FSH And LH, as we see there, LH goes to those thecal cells, as we just talked about. Those thecal cells are going to release androgens. The one that was on the previous slide was that androstenedione. Those androgens actually go into the other types of cells, the granulosa cells, and those get converted into estrogen. Okay, and then we can see LH causing the follicular growth there as well. And so both those hormones really lead to more estrogen release, as well as growth of the follicle. Okay, and we can see that both inhibin and estrogen are providing negative feedback to both the pituitary and the hypothalamus during these stages. Okay, but then this is where we have the kind of a shift in feedback. Once the follicle gets this big, this is that mature Graafian follicle. Looks like kind of a big clown face with a big smile there. But once it gets that big, that means there's a lot more cells to release estrogen. So estrogen levels get super high. When estrogen levels reach a tipping point, then that feedback turns from negative to positive. And so that's what we're seeing here is we're seeing positive feedback by estrogen. That positive feedback then causes that GnRH, which is a hypothalamic hormone you don't need to remember the name of, kind of surge and go to the pituitary, and then cause the pituitary to release a bunch of its hormones, but most importantly, LH. We get an LH surge. That LH is what causes ovulation to happen, right? So it luteinizes the follicle, turns the follicle into the corpus luteum, and causes ovulation. So then we can see the corpus luteum here, what's left of the follicle without the egg. And now the corpus luteum is releasing estrogen and inhibin like the follicle was before, but we're also seeing rising levels of progesterone at this point. So we get more progesterone release after ovulation occurs. So that's kind of the overall picture of the hormones. Now we'll kind of, once I give you a sec to finish writing that down, we'll kind of put that into play in each of the stages of the menstrual cycle and look at what's going on there. Questions about any of this so far? Okay. All right, let's go ahead and hop into the menstrual cycle next then. So with the menstrual cycle, it's typically not a 28-day cycle, but the standardized way to look at it, to understand it, and to kind of talk about it is using this 28-day standardized cycle. Okay, days 1 through 5 are the menstrual phase. Okay, and starts with the first sign of blood. This is the easiest one to tell where you're at because there's an actual physical sign of this, right? The reason that the bleeding starts is because the corpus luteum that was there before died off and it stopped, so it didn't release progesterone anymore. Progesterone was what was keeping the endometrium alive before, right? So the endometrium was staying alive because of that progesterone, and now the endometrium's starting to die off because progesterone levels drop. Okay, and so then it's the blood vessels and mucous membrane, all of that falls off. Somewhere around 30 mils of blood loss are typical for menstruation. Okay, GnRH, again, that's that hypothalamic hormone, FSH, LH, all these levels are low because progesterone was inhibiting those during that phase. Okay, so that's our day one. Okay, or not day one, but that's our phase one. Okay, the second phase is called the proliferative phase. Proliferation means growth, right? So we're getting lots of growth here, and there's growth in two places. The follicles are growing, and the endometrium is growing. Both of those things are growing here. Both those things are proliferating. Okay, so the hypothalamic hormone, LH, FSH, all these levels are rising. That recruits a bunch of eggs that are kind of like, all right, I'm ready to go. I can be ovulated. Let me go. Okay, but then only one of those is really going to rise to the top and actually go through the ovulation process. Okay, and again, all of this growth is being caused. The growth in the follicles is being caused by FSH. The growth in the endometrium is being caused by estrogen. And the bigger those follicles get, the more estrogen they release. And so that's why there's more and more estrogen being released throughout. Okay, so growing through the proliferative phase. And then we move into the third phase, which is ovulation, right? Or ovulatory phase. So this is right in the middle at day 14, okay? The follicle's as big as it's gonna get. It releases as much estrogen as it's gonna get. So high levels of estrogen, very high. Again, that switches to positive feedback, all right? Then that leads to the rush or the surge of LH, okay? And that surge of LH is what stimulates ovulation. So that's the key part there. And there's the name of that. Corpus luteum means yellow body. It's kind of what it looks like after it's released the egg. And then estrogen levels kind of plummet immediately after this. And this can be associated with some of the emotional symptoms related to in premenstrual syndrome, is that kind of plummeting levels of estrogen right after ovulation occurs. Okay, and then finally, the last 2 weeks of the menstrual cycle are the most consistent stage. Of these 2 weeks are typically the most consistent because the timeline is dependent on the life of the corpus luteum, which is pretty consistent. And so we can look at this from what the follicle is doing, or we can look at this from what the uterus is doing. Okay, so the corpus luteum, this would be the follicular view, right? Where the corpus luteum is what's left of the follicle. It's releasing a bunch of progesterone for those 2 weeks, okay? That progesterone is what causes a bunch of secretion, okay? So the secretory phase is referring to what the follicle's doing, okay? The luteal phase is referring to what the uterus is doing because it's the corpus luteum. Nope, that is backwards, sorry. I was like, wait, that doesn't sound right. Sorry, flip those. Here, let's do this. I don't want to confuse you. I got too excited there. Here we go. Try that one more time. Okay, so the secretions are happening in the uterus, is where we get a bunch of mucus secretion, and the follicle is now the corpus luteum, and so that's kind of that's what it's talking about, the two different views of this. So we're talking about what the follicle is doing or what the uterus is doing. Okay, so the secretory phase, again, this is the uterus releasing a bunch of mucus, is what creates the mucus plug, which is common, which is what happens in pregnancy. The cervix gets plugged up with a big plug of mucus, and sometime leading up to delivery, that mucus plug comes out. Sometimes that can be a sign that labor is coming. And lots of fluid retention, lots of increased blood flow here. And yeah, and then the corpus luteum is what's left of the follicle. It's releasing a lot of progesterone. Okay, so here's what I want you guys to do for a sec, is this slide, this one, this one, and this one. So we've got 4 slides here that walk us through what's going on in those phases. I want you guys to just kind of fill this in, okay? And I want you to write it too, because we're not going to have time when I uncover all of these for you to wait for me to write each one, okay? So you're just writing in the days, right? The days, what's happening with these. You can say that it's low or high or rising or falling, just something brief with all of these. And then what's the follicle doing? What's the uterus doing? Okay, so 4 slides. You just kind of recapping what we just talked about. You can go to the 5th slide here, which has all that kind of graph put together into one picture there, if you want to use that for your reference. Okay, go ahead. Take some time, work with your team on this. The menstrual cycle is complicated, but it's kind of fun too.
For the menstrual phase, what would be for estrogen is on the slide? Estrogen. Like, it's not really the active part of.
Not really on there, yeah. Yeah, so with the menstrual phase, this is where we have still pretty low estrogen, but you can also go to the 5th slide that kind of shows those graphs. That gives you an idea. Sorry, this one here. Yeah, this shows everything there too. That kind of walks you through, you know.
That's like progesterone. Oh, progesterone? Yeah, I guess like that's just. Estimate of. Oh, sorry.
Hello.
We have lots of questions.
I love it.
Can you only get pregnant while you're ovulating?
Yeah, it's like I think it starts around 24 to 48 hours after ovulation is like the time, and then for like another 24 to 48 hours, there's like maybe like a 3-day period in there.
Are you serious?
Yeah, yeah, that's the typical thing. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah.
And then how does like birth control play a part?
Yeah, we'll get to birth control here in a sec.
Okay.
Talk about the different kinds. Yeah. No.
Oh, yeah. Oh. So you know how there's like this thing where it's like, oh, like you're most fertile when the moon is full.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah,
I'm just curious.
yeah, I think it probably is, but I don't know.
But another thing is there's like this like red moon or like lunar eclipse or something.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, to be fair, I do get my information from TikTok. But it's like, oh yeah, like it's weird, like everyone's getting their period. And then I got my period and I wasn't supposed to get it during the moon. And I was like, it's
A moon, you never know what that moon's doing up there. I mean, that's like technically the answer for sure, but some eggs will live longer, than other eggs, right? Yeah, so it's not like a perfect answer, but it is like about a 2 to 3 day period around ovulation that's supposed to be the time where that can happen. Yeah.
yeah, that's used to me.
Yeah, yeah, which is like crazy when, people, because there's so many like married couples that try forever to get pregnant and they can't. And then so many people that aren't trying to get pregnant and they do. So it's like, yeah, it's kind of wild. But, yeah. All right, let's go ahead and come back together here. All right, so let's walk through this together here. So the menstrual phase, we're talking days 1 through 5, right? So these 3 hormones are always going to go together, right? So GnRH, LH, FSH, they're all low, but they're starting to rise, okay? They were being inhibited by progesterone. Now we're not getting as much of that. Progesterone levels are decreasing. That's what leads to the death of the endometrium and what leads to menstruation, okay? Estrogen levels are also decreasing. And the key things here, understanding what the follicle and what the uterus are doing, right? So the follicle was the corpus luteum and it died off, right? And since it died off, that's what led to the decrease in progesterone. And that decrease in progesterone is what led to menstruation, right? Because that's what causes the uterus to die. So the endometrium dies, and that is what is the menstruation is made up of, is that endometrial layer, the blood vessels and mucous membrane in that endometrial layer. Okay, questions on that one? Go ahead, listen. On your period? No. Yeah. Yeah, so there's a pretty small window, technically, the pregnancy can occur just kind of a few days within the window of ovulation is technically the time when pregnancy can happen, but there definitely are cases of stranger things happening, but in general, that's like the window is like a 3-day window around ovulation. Okay, second phase, proliferative phase. This is days 5 to 13. Okay, these 3 hormones are all higher now. Okay, and progesterone is still very low because we don't have the corpus luteum yet that's the main source of progesterone. Estrogen levels are starting to rise, okay, and they get very high towards the end. That's all related to the size of the follicle, right? The bigger the follicle is, the more estrogen is released. And so the follicle, what is it doing? It's growing. It's getting bigger and bigger and bigger, right? The uterus, same thing. That endometrial layer is growing, thickening, more mucous membrane, more blood vessels built into that. And so we can see that here with the follicle growing and the endometrial layer growing as well. Okay, that takes us into ovulation. So ovulation is day 14, right there in the middle. These 3 hormones are all surging, right? Because that estrogen turned into positive feedback instead of negative feedback. Okay, progesterone is going to rise right after ovulation, but during ovulation, it's still low. Okay, estrogen levels are as high as they're ever going to be, right? So we see this big peak in estrogen, right? And then it dips immediately after ovulation, okay? Because the follicle is so big and that's the source of estrogen, right? So the follicle is as big as it's going to be. It's releasing lots of estrogen. Then it obviously releases the egg. The uterus is still growing, still thickening, still preparing for possible implantation to happen. Go ahead, Krista.
Not just day 14, but you said it was like a 3-day window.
No, so the 3-day window kind of after ovulation is kind of the ideal time to fertilize the egg. Yeah. But no, ovulation is just that one kind of singular moment. Yeah. Okay. Other questions on that? Okay, then our last phase, secretory or luteal phase. Okay, again, secretory is referring to what the endometrium is doing. Luteal is referring to what the follicle is doing. This is the last 2 weeks, days 15 through 28. GnRH, LH, FSH are all low because progesterone is inhibiting their release. Progesterone is very high and it's coming from the corpus luteum. And again, it's inhibiting these 3 above. That's why those are low. Estrogen is also coming from the corpus luteum. It stays pretty high, right? So we see estrogen here. It's not as high as it was at the peak before ovulation, but it's still pretty high because the corpus luteum is still releasing it. Okay, the follicle is now just an endocrine organ. It is the corpus luteum. It's releasing those hormones. The uterus, that endometrial layer, is secreting a lot of mucus. This is the secretory phase, a lot of secretion happening. This is all in preparation for possible implantation of that fertilized egg. And the mucus plug is actually a visible thing that women can see a lot of times come out in the toilet. It comes out and it's like, oh, there's this big chunk of mucus that came out. And then again, that's kind of a sign that doesn't mean labor is coming like right away. It's not like the water breaking, but it is a sign that things are moving in that direction. For sure. Okay, questions on this? Okay, so then let's, this just puts all that together just for your reference. You can go back to that, puts all those little slices of graph together, which is helpful. Let's talk just briefly about pregnancy. Okay, so the fertilized egg is going to implant itself up in the upper 1/3 of the uterus typically. It's typically about 3 days after it gets fertilized. So it takes a while to make it down there. Okay, the placenta is the only organ in the body that's composed of 2 different people. Okay, and so the mom side of that is called the decidua. The baby side of that is called the chorion. Okay, and so one of the key hormones that causes the early growth in the fetus is called human chorionic gonadotropin, or HCG, right? And this is actually what's tested for in pregnancy tests, right? Pregnancy tests are looking for HCG. This is keeping the corpus luteum alive. And then the corpus luteum continues to release those hormones to keep the endometrium alive and keep the growth of the uterus happening. And yeah, and that's HCG. This is all three of our pregnancy tests that were positive. But yeah, Soren here. This was Christian when we told Christian that, or we told Soren that Mama was pregnant. He pulled up her shirt and said, "Oh, I see the baby in there. There it is." So that was cute. For our third pregnancy, my wife had what's known as hyperemesis gravidarum, which pretty much means you throw up all day, every day for the whole pregnancy. It was very brutal. She was in bed most of that pregnancy, but then even coming to class too, and having to take breaks and throw up in the middle of class, and it was horrible. But that was yeah. So luckily, she was our last kid and not our first one, because she would have been the last kid no matter what. But yeah, so that was that one. But real briefly here on birth control, we'll wrap it up with this. Bunch of different types of birth control. Earlier ones were synthetic estrogen. Estrogen is inhibitory to FSH and LH. So if we can stop FSH and LH release, the follicle doesn't grow, the endometrium doesn't grow as much, right? Some of them were also purely progesterone. If progesterone that stops ovulation because it makes it look like the woman is pregnant. Okay, so it stops the ovulation from happening again, stops follicular development. Most of those are now combo pills that include both some estrogen and progesterone, or patches that can do this. And then IUDs are very common now as well, where some of them are just metals that actually kind of irritate the uterus just enough to make sure implantation can happen. Some of them actually release hormones as well and do some of these same things. And this is what tubal ligation surgery looks like, just kind of blocking off those fallopian tubes so the egg and sperm can't meet up. So, all right, guys, we made it. Have a great rest of your day. We'll see you guys on Monday for the exam. All right, take care.